Hello and welcome to another special episode of Fault Lines, recorded live from RNDF and on our theme of Confronting the New Alliance of Global Repressors. I'm Jessica Jones, NSI's Deputy Executive Director, and I'm joined by John Lipsey, NSI's Director of Policy, and our special guest, Eric Edelman, Chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission, and most importantly, also Professor at SAIS. For those of you who can't recall his resume at a drop of a hat, Ambassador Edelman previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, as well as Ambassador to Finland during the Clinton administration, and to Turkey during the Bush administration, two countries we hear a lot about in the news, of course, as well as Vice President Cheney's Principal Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs. So, if you guys also haven't checked it out, Ambassador Edelman has an amazing podcast of his own. I know we're not supposed to hype up other shows here on ours, but do check it out, Shield of the Republic, which you co-host with Elliot Cohen.
Yes, indeed.
So, you've had two episodes this fall called Everything is Going to Hell, which couldn't be concluded in even one episode. You needed two parts. And then most recently, you had former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates on to talk about his recent Foreign Affairs article, which he begins by saying the U.S. now confronts greater threats to its security than it has in decades, perhaps ever. Do you think that sentiment is really how all policymakers are feeling about the current state of geopolitics?
And I can't speak for all policymakers. Really, I can only speak for myself. But first, Jessica, it's great to be here with you and John. It's great to be here at the Reagan Library for the RNDF, which is, I think, just a fantastic event. I came to the first 7, wasn't able to, come to the 2 after COVID, and now glad to
Don't worry, I will
back.
reference your 23rd. It's RNDF at 10. You were at the first one.
I was at the first one.
Yeah, that'll come up later.
Yeah, I was at the first one. So, look, I can't speak for everybody, but I think there is a general feeling among people who closely follow national security that we are entering in a very difficult and dangerous period, some parts of which are absolutely unprecedented. I mean, one element which I've looked at a little bit is the fact that, according to the Department of Defense's reports on Chinese military power, China is developing a nuclear capability that will ultimately, by the mid-2030s, match numerically the nuclear capabilities of the United States and Russia. I previously used to say that there was only one country that was a truly existential threat to the United States, which was Russia, because of its large nuclear arsenal. We'll now have 2 peer rivals in the nuclear realm, and that is a circumstance the United States of America has never faced, certainly since the advent of nuclear weapons in 1945. But moreover, I think we're facing a challenging era. It's been brewing, I would say, for a decade, but it's an era of greater disorder globally. And I know that people talk about the rules-based global order. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin just did that in his luncheon speech here. And without in any way implying any disrespect to Secretary Austin, whom I admire, whenever I hear rules-based international order, my eyes glaze over. I think most Americans' eyes glaze over too. But here's the thing: the global order that was established after 1945 really rested on one important principle that was in the UN Charter that was adopted in 1945. And that was after the experience of the Second World War, in a world that now was armed with nuclear weapons, at first only the United States, but it was pretty clear ultimately these weapons would spread to other nations, that a world of unbridled, premeditated, unprovoked aggression by nation states against one another was not an acceptable way for people to live. And the United States developed a series of alliance relationships and then trading relationships that led to a greater open trading system that increased global prosperity over the years. When people talk about the rules-based international, that is largely what they're talking about. The system of alliances that the U.S. built to provide for collective self-defense, both in Europe and in Asia, and then later through special relationships with a series of countries in the Middle East, notably Israel, Egypt, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE to some extent. And it's that system that's under attack. And it's over a decade now we've seen more and more examples of aggression, which has met with, I would say, an inadequate response from the international community, certainly from the United States. And the result of that is greater disorder. And I think if Americans look around and say, God, the world looks like it's going to hell, it's a mess, it's because it is. I mean, you've got the largest war in Europe since 1945. You have a terrible war, first of all, horrific, barbaric atrocities against Israelis committed by Hamas, and now a very, serious war in Gaza that has the prospect, the potential of spreading, more broadly regionally. You have, obviously, the People's Republic of China acting in more and more provocative ways in the South China Sea, to some degree in the East China Sea. But there's lots else going on in the world that doesn't get much attention. You've had the ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh by Azerbaijan, and the threat of perhaps even more aggression against Armenia by Azerbaijan as a result. You've got a huge civil war going on in Sudan. We've just finished a war in the Horn of Africa, but it's a very unsettled situation among Ethiopia, Tigray, and Eritrea. We've got massive problems with in the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa with terrorism. And to me, this is very reminiscent of what social science literature tells us about domestic affairs, which is the so-called broken windows theory. If you have a neighborhood where a window gets broken by vandals, if it's not fixed very quickly, and if there's not a police presence there pretty much immediately thereafter, you will then get more broken windows, and in a pretty short period of time you'll get a very lawless, disordered urban area. I think the same is true in international affairs, and I think we're seeing that play out.
Do you think, putting aside the defense community, the American public, they read all those headlines, and at some point they kind of begin to tune out, right? There's just terrible and hard headlines every single day. Do you think they feel that there's the same sentiment? Or, do they want, America engaged in global affairs, or is it just, we're not going to be able to deal with all these crises, we need to, concentrate and focus here at home?
There's always been the tendency in our history to want to avoid political entanglements, outside our own hemisphere. We've always been willing to police our own hemisphere, starting right from the beginning of our nationhood. But outside the hemisphere, we've been very leery about taking on political commitments. Ultimately, after two enormous world wars in Europe, we did that. And Americans paid a lot of attention in the Cold War to these kinds of issues, in part because we lived under the threat in a bipolar Cold War conflict between two superpowers, both armed with nuclear weapons, as Senator Lieberman once put it in the title of his book. I think actually stole it from Oppenheimer. Two scorpions in a bottle. But since the end of the Cold War, there's been waning attention to this. The news hole for international affairs in most, periodicals and news magazines has essentially gone away. Actually, news magazines have gone away. I mean, Newsweek's not even in print anymore.
Yeah.
And Time, I'm not even sure, is that might still be, kind of
Person of the Year is pretty much
vestigally in print, but they're both basically now online magazines. So Americans don't pay a lot of attention to this. But they're aware of the consequences, as you were saying. And I think Americans, understand that there's a lot of disorder in the world and they don't like it. Mm-hmm. I think they find that worrisome and threatening. What I don't think has happened is I don't think our political class, and I'm being bipartisan here, I think it's both Republicans and Democrats, have done enough to explain to the American people how much our freedom and our prosperity depends on some modicum of order in international affairs, and that aggression that is not met with a response will breed more aggression, and that's not a world. It's going to be a world with more disorder, which is going to make them more unhappy, and put greater stress on our ability to maintain our own prosperity, because in the modern world, prosperity in one country paraphrase Stalin, is not really possible. So, I don't think Americans have realized how dire the situation is. How, in particular, judging just by the results of the polling that the Reagan Institute has done, one of the things that really struck me from the poll, which, as you both know, was unveiled this morning at the opening session, Americans think we're, behind in AI to the Chinese, but we're, got the greatest military in the world. Well, we do have the greatest military in the world, but the challenges that we face operating if we got into a conflict with China are so great. I don't think Americans have an appreciation of that. The challenges are great and growing. I co-chaired the National Defense Strategy Commission 5 years ago with Admiral Gary Ruffhead, and we raised the question in that report of, if current trends continued, we said at that time, the United States would be at risk of being on the losing end of a conflict. And we sketched out a few vignettes of how that might happen. The Department of Defense was not very happy with us. They wanted to classify those, even though there was nothing classified about them. We finally got Secretary Mattis to agree we could publish all this. Since that time, the problems have all gotten worse, and the things that we're doing to address them have not kept up with the pace of how much things have gotten worse. So we're behind the curve.
I was looking at the 2013 RNDF agenda just to see, what the topics were, and you were a speaker at their first one, actually, on the National Defense Strategy, looking 10 years forward, and you're chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission now, reviewing the report. And the report points out the large threat posed by authoritarian governments and with revisionist foreign policy agendas. And we talk a lot about kind of the growing collaboration between countries like China, Iran, and Russia. Is that something we should have anticipated? Is that really surprising? They're growing. I want, obviously not partnerships. There's no formal alliance, but could we have anticipated that? Are we doing enough to address their growing relationship?
We probably could have anticipated that. We probably should have anticipated that better as a nation than we have. And you're quite right. There's no kind of formal alliance, but you can see just a pattern of how we're moving potentially into we're on the cusp, I would say, of a global conflict. It's not World War III, the way I think some people have conceived of it. It's not World War III with, Slim Pickens riding down, to Earth on the back of an H-bomb in Dr. Strangelove. But it is global in the sense that if you look at what Russia is doing in Ukraine and Hamas in Israel, Russia is being supplied by 1 million shells produced in North Korea, traveling by train across, the expanse of Russia. The Russian effort is essentially being financed because of all the sanctions that the U.S. and its allies have levied on Russia, by financing provided by the People's Republic of China and the PRC and a few other countries, including Turkey, who are allowing dual-use goods to circumvent sanctions and flow into Russia, allowing them to up their military production because they have expended enormous and lost enormous amounts of military equipment in the last almost 2 years of war with Ukraine. You see Iran providing support to Russia in the form of Shahed drones that the Russians are using to attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure and urban targets. And you see the possibility that Russia may give, the administration has warned of the possibility that Russia might provide Iran with missile technology and missile know-how. And Iran, of course, turns around and provides some of the very same know-how and equipment to Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south. I don't want to litigate the issue of whether or not Iran knew about the Hamas raid on October 7th in Israel before the fact or not. As Jake Sullivan has said, the National Security Advisor, Iran is deeply complicit in this because they've been providing training, smuggling missiles and rockets into Gaza for years, and none of this could have happened without the material support provided by by Iran. So all of this is sort of, all of our adversaries, our great power adversaries, Russia and China, our, lesser adversaries, the nuclear proliferants like North Korea or would-be nuclear proliferants like Iran, are all tied together in this. And it makes, I think, for a very dangerous time.
I am, as former ambassador to Turkey, we talk on the show about kind of the middle powers and not necessarily standing as close to the U.S. as they used to, whether it's South Africa, whether it's India at times, or whether it's Turkey, and what we do as they remain neutral on issues like Ukraine, what we do when they kind of take a more transactional approach to diplomacy. How do we bring them closer, right? How do we bring them back, if possible?
Yeah, with Turkey, it's an interesting question. It's not clear to me that at least as long as Recep Tayyip Erdogan is alive, that it's possible to repair the relationship. In particular, since October 7th, his rhetoric has been, pretty blood-curdling in terms of his support for Hamas, his pretty unrestrained criticism of Israel and of the United States for its support of Israel. I think with Turkey, the country remains an important one. As long as it's governed by this regime, it's going to be highly problematic as an ally. It has not been behaving like an ally. We had a senior Treasury official in Turkey just recently expressing great concern about some of what I was talking about earlier, the evasion of sanctions by Turkey with regard to Russia, as well as financial support that flows through Turkey for Hamas. So this is going to be a very problematic relationship for some time to come. I think it's important for us to remember that Turkey remains a deeply divided society, and that Erdogan really only represents barely 50% of the country, if that. And so I think we have to have a very kind of long game approach, to Turkey, which is very tricky to execute. To be fair to current policymakers, it's very difficult to manage that kind of relationship, particularly when you've got so much going on in the world where Turkey is relevant, because Turkey is a Black Sea littoral country, so it controls access to the Black Sea because of the Montreux Convention. It obviously has a role in the Eastern Mediterranean, including over oil and gas, which is an undersea asset that is being developed by a variety of countries, including Israel, including Cyprus, and where Turkey has really enormous claims that sort of rival China's claims in the East China Sea and elsewhere in terms of the breathtaking breadth that they've expressed. So it's going to be a big challenge for a long time.
Okay, so we're moving into a new year. At the start of 2021, I think some people might have predicted, Russian aggression, but I think at the start of 2022, at the start of 2023, I think, what happened in Israel, I think took a lot of people by surprise. What do you think 2024 has in store?
My experience over the last few years has made me very chary about making predictions.
I knew that.
Secretary Gates, who you mentioned earlier, for whom I worked, used to say we have a 100% record in the Department of Defense of predicting the next war. We always get it wrong. So I think there are just many worrying signs on the horizon. I mean, tomorrow, Venezuela is going to have a referendum about claims it has on oil-rich provinces of Western Guyana, excuse me. Is that a precursor to a Venezuelan land grab? I mean, these issues have been, go back to the late 19th century. The U.S. had to interpose itself in those days, and Britain had to interpose itself with regard to Venezuela. So this is not a new issue, but it's being resuscitated in an era where already land grabs and territorial aggression have become, more frequent. So is that going to be the next one? Could be. Hopefully cooler heads will prevail and they won't do that. But hopefully it's just Maduro, stirring up, nationalism before his own election coming up. But, it it could come anywhere, because the more of this we tolerate, the more of this we will have.
Where would you put China and the South China Sea and Taiwan on that scale of, in the near future?
Well, that's a worry, because as both of you know, Xi Jinping has directed the PLA to be prepared to take Taiwan by force by 2027 if necessary. Now, that doesn't mean they've made a decision that they're going to invade Taiwan in 2027. I'm not even sure that they would ever invade Taiwan. I think there are other options that they have that would maybe be easier for them to execute and carry somewhat less risk, like a blockade, for instance, of the island, which would be very problematic for the United States and our other allies in East Asia to manage. So, and there's a debate about whether, which way time is running here. Hal Brands and Mike Beckley have a book, The Danger Zone, which argues that we're hitting peak China, and that's not inconsistent with some of the economic difficulties we see China having, the demographic decline that we're seeing. And they say, well, that actually means, that it's peak China is actually more dangerous than a rising China. Other people think China's still rising, or it's already declining. So, it's choose your poison. But the truth is, there's potential danger here under any one of those scenarios. And we need to clearly strengthen our ability to deter China in the South China Sea and in the Strait. And that's going to require a long-term investment in defense capabilities, and it's also going to require us to reposition ourselves in the Indo-Pacific, and that is extremely difficult when you have a war going on in Europe and a war going on in the Middle East, and it's a draw on our defense resources.
Sorry, listeners, I was trying to end on a positive note, but somehow we just got a little bit darker than that when we started. Of course, that's a wrap. Thanks so much again to Ambassador Edelman for joining us. Thanks to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the rest of the NSI team for producing today's special episode. We are also on YouTube, so if you want to check us out there, please watch us. And if you like what you heard or saw, which you should and must, do please subscribe and rate and review.